I do want to share a word that I also told Erica about, that I will double down at this time. And that is, as TPUSA, as Club America seeks to expand chapters in schools across the state, let me be clear. Any school that stands in the way of a Club America program in their school should be reported immediately to the Texas Education Agency, where I expect meaningful disciplinary action to be taken place for any stoppage of TPUSA in the great state of Texas.
You just heard it from the governor's mouth. Schools blocking TPUSA could face meaningful disciplinary action from the Texas Education Agency. And what you're witnessing right now is nothing less than the wholesale weaponization of public education in service of a Republican partisan machine that has finally dropped its pretense and revealed its authoritarian heart. This is the moment when the slow-simmering culture war that conservatives have been waging for decades erupts into a full-scale assault on the very concept of education as a shared public good separate from partisan indoctrination. And you need to understand that what Greg Abbott just announced at his Monday press conference, alongside Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, is so staggeringly brazen that it would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. They're not hiding it anymore because they've calculated correctly that they have the power to get away with it, and the implications should terrify anyone who believes schools are supposed to be spaces where young people learn critical thinking rather than where state authorities mandate enrollment in a single ideological youth movement. Because here's what we're actually talking about when we discuss the partnership between Abbott, Patrick, and Turning Point USA to create chapters on every Texas high school campus. This isn't some neutral civic organization promoting debate and engagement. Turning Point USA was co-founded by Charlie Kirk, who built an entire empire around far-right activism on college campuses. Liberal organizations viewed Kirk as a far-right provocateur who embraced controversial issues while defending Trump's MAGA movement. Now Texas Republicans want mandatory access to every single high school in a state with 5.5 million students, and they're leveraging the full power of state government to threaten any principal or superintendent who dares to resist this takeover. Just think about the chilling audacity of a governor standing at a podium and telling school administrators that if they don't welcome this particular conservative organization into their buildings, they should be reported to the state education agency for punishment. This is the same playbook we've seen in Oklahoma, where former Superintendent Ryan Walters threatened to go after the accreditation of schools that refused to welcome the conservative group, and Florida, where Republican officials have announced similar partnerships. And what we're watching unfold is a coordinated multi-state strategy to transform American public high schools into recruiting grounds for the Republican Party. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, don't students have First Amendment rights to form political clubs, and doesn't the Equal Access Act already protect that? And you would be absolutely correct, which makes what Abbott is doing here even more insidious because he's not talking about students voluntarily organizing themselves. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick pledged $1 million in campaign funds to establish Turning Point USA chapters at every high school and college in Texas. They're pouring money and institutional pressure into creating these chapters with state officials personally involved in the coordination, and that fundamentally transforms this from student speech into state-sponsored political organizing. This is about using the machinery of government to embed a partisan organization into schools, and then threatening educators who resist with their jobs and their school's accreditation. And if you think that's hyperbole, just listen again to Abbott's threat about reporting schools immediately to the Texas Education Agency. Texas Education Commissioner Mike Morath met with a top TPUSA official to discuss creating new chapters in every Texas high school, so the highest education official in the state is personally involved in coordinating with this conservative activist group. And we need to talk about what Turning Point USA actually represents, because understanding their ideology and tactics is essential to grasping why this partnership is so dangerous. Kirk's efforts focused in part on rooting out what he and allies considered left-wing bias through creating a professor watch list, a school board watch list, and launching a private school network in response to woke curriculum. This is an organization built around the paranoid conspiratorial claim that American education is controlled by leftist indoctrinators, and their solution is to create their own parallel indoctrination infrastructure. The professor watch lists alone should tell you everything you need to know about their commitment to academic freedom. They literally created databases to target and harass educators whose viewpoints they disagreed with, and now Abbott wants to give them privileged access to every teenager in Texas. And when critics raise concerns about political indoctrination in schools, Scholars note TPUSA's push into high schools is part of a broader strategy to advance Christian nationalism after training students for 8 years in Turning Point's values, and that's the plan. Get them young, shape their political identities during their formative years, build a pipeline from high school TPUSA clubs to college TPUSA chapters to Turning Point Action and the broader conservative movement. The timing of this push is absolutely critical to understand, because since Charlie Kirk's assassination, the organization reported receiving 54,000 inquiries about starting new chapters within days, and Republican officials are capitalizing on this moment of right-wing martyrdom and movement energy to ram through partnerships that embed TPUSA permanently into public schools, and Patrick claimed over 135,000 requests have been made to start TPUSA chapters since Kirk's death. Whether or not those numbers are inflated, the narrative is clear. They're presenting this as organic grassroots demand when what's actually happening is sophisticated top-down organizing funded by Republican campaign dollars and coordinated with state education agencies. This isn't students spontaneously deciding they want TPUSA clubs. This is Republican governors and lieutenant governors and education commissioners working hand in glove with a partisan organization to manufacture that demand and punish anyone who stands in the way. And we absolutely must examine this within the broader context of what Texas Republicans have been doing to public education, because this TPUSA partnership doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a multi-pronged assault that includes Abbott campaigning against House Republicans who opposed his voucher program and successfully securing a majority who supported his ESA program. So he spent millions of dollars in primary elections to purge his own party members who defended public schools, and now he's got the votes to pass his voucher scheme. And Abbott spent more than $8 million on House primaries to oust anti-voucher Republicans. This is a coordinated strategy to simultaneously defund public schools through vouchers while using what remains of them as indoctrination centers for conservative politics. They want to hollow out public education from within while funneling taxpayer money to private religious schools with zero accountability. And the biggest bill from the 2025 legislative session was a $1 billion voucher program. So they're redirecting $1 billion away from public schools that serve all students toward private schools that can discriminate and teach whatever ideology they want. The hypocrisy is so staggering it almost defies comprehension, because for years we have heard Republican politicians and conservative media figures scream about indoctrination in schools. They've banned books and censored curriculum and attacked teachers and passed laws restricting how educators can discuss race and gender and American history. Abbott signed Texas Senate Bill 10 requiring all public schools to display the 10 Commandments in their classroom. They want religious doctrine literally on the walls, and researchers have found there's no rampant left-wing bias among public school teachers indoctrinating students into hating the country. So the entire moral panic about woke indoctrination was always projection. It was always conservatives furious that they didn't control the ideological content of education and determined to seize that control by any means necessary. And now, it's turned the whole argument on its head, as state education officials in red states boast about partnering with conservative organizations to establish chapters in every high school. Imagine if blue state governors announced partnerships with the ACLU and Indivisible to put progressive organizing chapters in every school. Republicans would lose their minds. And yet here they are doing exactly that with impunity. We also need to understand how this fits into the broader Republican strategy around education that political scientists have documented. Democrats and Republicans are rapidly sorting or taking opposing positions on a range of education issues. The partisan gap on teachers' unions has grown by an average of 1.4 percentage points per year, culminating in a 40-point divide in union support. By 2022, education has been rapidly politicized and weaponized, as Republicans recognize that controlling schools means controlling the next generation of voters, and undermining one of the last remaining sources of institutional power for labor organizing. Grover Norquist recognized that school choice reaches right into the heart of the Democratic coalition and takes people out of it. They've been explicit about this. Destroying public education and teachers' unions is a partisan political strategy designed to weaken Democrats, and it's dressed up in the language of parental rights and school choice. But the real goal is dismantling a public institution that conservatives view as ideologically hostile to their movement. And what better way to complete that project than by forcing every public high school to host Republican youth clubs funded by Republican campaign dollars and coordinated by Republican state officials. Now let's talk about the specifically Texan dimensions of this, because Texas is in many ways the perfect laboratory for this kind of authoritarian educational takeover. The state already has extraordinary control over textbook markets and curriculum standards that affect the entire country. the Texas market for academic resources has never been this unpredictable after the state completely overhauled its adoption process for instructional materials as part of a sweeping 2023 law. So Republicans have been systematically restructuring how education works in Texas to concentrate more power at the state level where they have total control. Texans spent a staggering $112 million last year to manage culturally divisive conflicts in schools, money that should help support students and teachers. The culture wars are already draining resources from actual education, and now Abbott wants to intensify those battles by mandating access for a partisan organization whose entire purpose is to fight the culture war inside schools. The damage this will do to students and educators and communities cannot be overstated, because when you turn schools into battlegrounds for partisan politics, you destroy the possibility of education as a shared civic enterprise. The union president said groups with such a divisive political presence are inappropriate for the K-12 environment. And he's absolutely right, because high school students are still developing their political identities and critical thinking skills, and subjecting them to state-sponsored pressure to join a partisan organization is pedagogically destructive and ethically abhorrent. Teachers already face impossible pressures trying to educate students with inadequate resources while navigating culture war minefields where parents and politicians scrutinize every lesson plan, and now they'll have to deal with state-backed TPUSA organizers in their buildings, recruiting students and creating additional political tension. And you can bet that any teacher who expresses skepticism about TPUSA or refuses to sponsor their clubs will be targeted and harassed, just like the educators who've already faced retaliation for social media posts about Kirk. And we need to be crystal clear about the broader authoritarian trajectory this represents, because when state governments use their power to embed partisan organizations into public institutions and threaten punishment for resistance that is textbook authoritarianism, it's the kind of thing we associate with autocratic regimes, not democratic republics. Imagine if Viktor Orban in Hungary announced that Fidesz youth clubs would be established in every school, and principals who refused would face disciplinary action from the government. We would recognize that immediately as authoritarian control of civil society, and yet that's exactly what's happening in Texas right now. Republican leaders at state and national levels are propelling TPUSA further into K-12 schools, and the organization says it already has more than 1,000 chapters in high schools across the country. So this is a national movement, not just a Texas aberration. And the U.S. Department of Education announced it was partnering with TPUSA and dozens of other conservative groups to launch a coalition to produce educational materials. The federal government under Trump is coordinating with state governments to systematically embed conservative organizations into the educational infrastructure. The historical parallels are genuinely chilling when you consider how authoritarian movements have always recognized education as the key to long-term ideological control. This is why fascist regimes invariably seize control of schools early in their consolidation of power. It's why the Hitler Youth was mandatory, and why every totalitarian system creates youth organizations to indoctrinate children into state ideology before they develop the capacity for critical resistance. And I'm not saying Abbott is literally Hitler, that would be absurd and counterproductive, but I am saying that mandatory or state-pressured youth political organizations in schools are a hallmark of authoritarian governance, and Americans should be alarmed when we see our elected officials embracing those tactics. Walters announced state-mandated chapters of Club America to ensure students understand American greatness while enabling them to engage in civic dialogue, which is the same kind of doublespeak every authoritarian regime uses when they mean ideological conformity and political indoctrination. What makes this especially insidious is how it exploits the language of freedom and choice and civic engagement to accomplish the opposite. Abbott and Patrick and the TPUSA representatives all talk about promoting debate and dialogue and free speech, but what they're actually doing is using state power to privilege one particular ideological perspective and punish schools that resist. Abbott's press secretary said TPUSA plays a vital role in shaping the hearts and minds of young Texans, helping grow the next generation of principled Texas leaders. They're not even hiding the fact that this is about ideological formation. Shaping hearts and minds is literally the language of indoctrination. And the Orwellian inversion is complete when they claim that forcing schools to host TPUSA chapters or face state punishment is somehow promoting freedom and opposing indoctrination. It's the same cognitive dissonance we see throughout the conservative movement, where freedom means the freedom to impose their values, and censorship means anyone who resists that imposition. We also need to examine the racial and class dimensions of this assault, because it's not coincidental that Republicans are pursuing this strategy at the exact moment when American schools are becoming more diverse and when demographic change threatens conservative political dominance. Texas public education has become a battleground for right-wing ideologues aiming to embed Christian nationalist values in the classroom and to defund or privatize schools serving about 5.5 million students. So this is about maintaining white Christian cultural hegemony in a state that's rapidly becoming majority-minority, and the voucher programs that Republicans are pushing alongside the TPUSA partnership will disproportionately benefit wealthy families who can afford private school tuition even with subsidies while gutting funding for the public schools that serve poor and working-class students who are disproportionately Black and Latino. The entire project is shot through with racist and classist logic. Create a two-tier system where affluent white students get private religious education funded by taxpayers, while poor students of color are trapped in underfunded public schools that have been transformed into holding pens with state-sponsored conservative indoctrination programs. And let's talk about what this means for teachers, because educators are already under sustained attack from Republican politicians and conservative activists, and this TPUSA partnership represents an escalation of that campaign. The organization's professor watch list targeting instructors it sees as promoting liberal viewpoints has stirred tension as faculty members say they faced harassment from conservative. They've created infrastructure specifically designed to target and harass educators, and now state governments are giving them privileged access to schools, and we've already seen teachers placed on leave or forced to resign for social media posts critical of Kirk. A Wentzville teacher was placed on leave after screenshots of posts alluding to Kirk's killing were circulated by state senators. So Republican elected officials are actively working to get teachers fired for expressing political opinions outside of school, and you can imagine the chilling effect this has on educators, who know that if they criticize TPUSA or refuse to facilitate their organizing, they might face retaliation not just from activists but from state government itself. The legal and constitutional questions here are profound, because while students absolutely have First Amendment rights to form political clubs including conservative ones, there's a fundamental difference between student-initiated voluntary association and state-mandated privileged access for a specific partisan organization. If students want to start a TPUSA chapter, schools generally can't stop them under the Equal Access Act. But what Abbott is doing goes far beyond that. He's threatening schools with punishment if they don't actively facilitate TPUSA organizing, and he's coordinating with state education officials to make it happen, and Republican politicians are funding it with campaign dollars. That transforms this from protected student speech into something that looks an awful lot like viewpoint discrimination by government officials. The announcement raises concerns of potentially state-mandated political indoctrination or political bias at public schools, and you have to wonder whether the Establishment Clause has anything to say about state governments partnering with an organization that explicitly promotes Christian nationalism to shape students' hearts and minds. What's so maddening about all of this is how completely it vindicates everything progressives have been saying about the Republican agenda for education. We've been warning for years that school choice is a Trojan horse for privatization, that attacks on critical race theory and gender ideology are pretext for censorship and indoctrination, that the whole parental rights movement is actually about imposing conservative Christian values on everyone's children, and we've been dismissed as alarmist and hysterical. And now here's Greg Abbott, literally announcing a partnership to embed a far-right organization into every public high school and threatening punishment for schools that resist. They're doing everything we warned about openly and brazenly, because they've calculated that they have enough power to get away with it. And the tragedy is that millions of Americans have been conditioned by decades of right-wing propaganda to see this as defending freedom rather than recognizing it as the authoritarian power grab it actually is. And we need to understand the stakes for democracy itself, because education has always been understood as the foundation of democratic citizenship. An educated populace capable of critical thinking and civic engagement is essential for self-governance. And when you transform schools into sites of partisan indoctrination, you undermine that foundation and create conditions for democratic collapse. Political scientists warn this divided era in education will be defined by congressional gridlock, partisan animosity, and stark differences in schooling based on whether a child's state is red or blue. So we're heading toward a situation where what counts as education depends entirely on partisan control of state government, and children growing up in red states will receive fundamentally different political socialization than children in blue states, and that makes shared civic identity and democratic deliberation almost impossible. How can we function as a democratic polity when half the country's children are being taught that the other half are enemies to be defeated rather than fellow citizens with whom we share a political community? The response from progressives needs to be both immediate and long-term, because we cannot allow this to become normalized. Every school board and superintendent in Texas needs to understand that they have legal options and political support if they choose to resist Abbott's threats. Civil liberties organizations need to be preparing litigation, challenging the constitutionality of state-sponsored partisan organizing in schools. Teachers' unions need to mobilize their members to document and oppose TPUSA overreach, and parents and community members need to show up at school board meetings and demand that their public schools remain public, not privatized recruiting grounds for the Republican Party. And yes, this will be difficult, and yes, there will be retaliation, and yes, some educators will lose their jobs, but that's always been the price of resistance to authoritarianism, and the alternative is accepting the transformation of American education into a partisan indoctrination system. But beyond the immediate resistance, we need a much broader political project to reclaim education as a public good and defend it against privatization and partisan capture. That means electing Democrats and progressives at every level, from school boards to state legislatures to Congress, and using that power to adequately fund public schools, support teachers, protect academic freedom, and resist the authoritarian impulses of the conservative movement. Progressive candidates ousted conservative incumbents in districts throughout Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth and El Paso, so there is pushback happening, and voters are rejecting the culture war agenda when they have the chance. But it requires sustained organizing and political mobilization to counter the massive resources and institutional power that Republicans are deploying in this fight. We also need to be honest about the ideological stakes, because this isn't just about partisan advantage, it's about two fundamentally incompatible visions of what education should be. The conservative vision increasingly is that education should transmit traditional values, produce patriotic citizens who love America, prepare workers for the economy, and reinforce existing social hierarchies of race and class and gender. The progressive vision is that education should develop critical thinking, foster democratic citizenship, promote equality and justice, question unjust hierarchies, and empower students to transform society. Those visions cannot be reconciled through compromise or dialogue. They represent incommensurable commitments about human flourishing and social organization, and the fight over education is ultimately a fight about what kind of society we want to be. Do we want a society where young people are taught to accept authority and tradition and hierarchy, or do we want a society where they're taught to question and challenge and transform unjust systems? And when you understand that this is fundamentally a conflict between authoritarian and democratic visions of education, it becomes clear why Republicans are so desperate to seize control of schools. They recognize that the emancipatory potential of education is a threat to their entire political project. Critically educated citizens who understand history and can analyze power and recognize injustice are much harder to manipulate with fear and resentment and nationalist mythology. That's why authoritarians always attack education, why fascists burned books, why segregationists fought integration, why conservatives have been waging culture war against universities for decades. Education is dangerous to systems of domination and control when it's done right, and the only way to neutralize that danger is to transform education into indoctrination, which is exactly what Abbott and Patrick and TPUSA are attempting in Texas. The final thing I want to say is that this moment demands moral clarity and political courage from everyone who believes in democracy and justice. We cannot afford to be moderate or cautious or diplomatic in the face of what's happening. When a governor threatens schools with punishment for refusing to host a partisan organization that is an authoritarian assault on public education, and it needs to be called exactly that. When state governments coordinate with far-right groups to embed their organizations into schools, that is the behavior of authoritarian regimes, and we need to say so clearly and loudly. And yes, that kind of language will be dismissed as hyperbolic and alarmist and divisive, but the truth is that we are living through a genuinely dangerous moment of democratic erosion and authoritarian advance, and the greatest danger is not that we'll be too alarmist, but that we'll normalize these developments and fail to mount adequate resistance until it's too late. So to everyone watching this, to educators and parents and students and citizens, understand that what Greg Abbott announced in Texas is not normal, and it's not acceptable, and it cannot be allowed to succeed. This is a test of whether Americans will defend public education as a democratic institution or allow it to be captured by partisan authoritarians. This is a test of whether we believe schools should develop critical thinking or enforce ideological conformity. This is a test of whether we're willing to fight for democracy or whether we'll surrender it piece by piece to aspiring autocrats who recognize that controlling education means controlling the future. The time for resistance is now, before these TPUSA chapters are established in every school, before this becomes so normalized that people forget it was ever controversial, before a generation of Texas students is subjected to state-sponsored conservative indoctrination. We have to fight and we have to win, because the alternative is unconscionable. The alternative is accepting that American public education will be transformed from a democratic institution into a partisan weapon, and if we allow that to happen, we will have failed not just this generation, but all the generations to come, who will inherit a democracy we were too cowardly or complacent to defend.